When it comes to our perceptions of the world, we are only going to be able to see the world as a reflection of our own stage of conscious development. In other words, you can't see the world beyond your own stage of being able to see yourself. Now, within this, I want to go over four different types of essentially ego development. This comes from a system called integral theory by a guy named Ken Wilber. I highly recommend checking out his work if you haven't, but I'm going to break down a very simplified version of this today, just so we can understand the development of the ego and how a lot of people who are seeing the world, who might seem crazy to you, just might not be able to see it from the same level as you. So, within this framework, as I said, we have four different stages. The first being what's called egocentric. Now, to be egocentric would be like, it's just me, there's nobody else, everything outside of me is separate from me, and maybe even a threat, maybe even an enemy, and I am the only thing. This would be like a kind of person that has no empathy for anything outside of themselves. Like, if someone else gets hurt, if they hurt somebody else, they're not going to feel anything over it. This is just purely like me versus the world. I am the only thing. That is the first stage. Now, thankfully, I think most of humanity has evolved beyond this stage. And that brings me to the second stage, which is called ethnocentric. Ethnocentricity is essentially this sense of sort of tribalism, where the ego's evolved beyond it's just me to now it's this specific group that I am identified with, but there's still us and there's still them. Now, this is the stage that most of humanity is operating on right now, where we see my country and your country, my party and your party, my team and your team. It is always an us and them, us versus them, our tribe versus their tribe. We can't let their tribe come onto our land because we can't let them steal our cattle. We can't let them come and steal our crops. This is ours, and everything outside of us is like an enemy, right? It's something that we don't want to, they're not part of us. That's the separation. So this is a step above, like it's just me. But now we have this sense of it's still us and it's still them. And the interesting thing about this, like I said, we have most of humanity operating on this stage. It actually means they're unable to see the world in a state of interconnectedness or oneness, which brings me to the third topic, the third category, which is called world-centric. Now, world-centric, this is essentially when someone first has their conscious awakening. Now, remember, all of these stages are in relation to the ego. There are many other like structures that are interlaced between all of these specific categories, but this all has to do with the ego and its perception, its ability to perceive things around it as self or other. Okay, so this third category, being world-centric, is when a being first has the realization that this world as it is a singular entity, that we are all one, we are all sharing the same consciousness, and we're just little pieces of it. It's like we're all drops of water in the ocean, and each one of those drops is individual, but it is still a drop in that ocean. It is still one, it is still the same thing. This is the world-centric viewpoint. And this is where most people who are consciously awakened have gotten to, if not further than this. This is an important stage because this is the first stage at which a sense of unity actually becomes available to the individual, where it's no longer like self and other. It's no longer good and bad. It's no longer like the essentially hero and enemy, like good and evil, this sort of thing, where you're perceiving an actual opponent or an enemy outside of yourself that is a threat to your own consciousness, to your own being. This is the stage where things actually become unified and you start to see that as, okay, all of this is self and all this is a reflection of self, and depending on how I essentially orient myself, I'm going to see that reflection come back through that of what we call others, which are just mirrors of ourself. So with this, we get to the next stage called cosmocentric, and this is essentially seeing the whole universe, the whole galaxy, all of the universes as a singular entity. You see the true oneness, the true cosmic oneness in the universe, in all things that are, all things that exist, and recognize that you are an integrated part of all of that, and there really is no separation between anything. This is a much more advanced stage of realization. And I would say that even for like the stage that humanity is at right now, being world centric is very advanced. You're very much above the curve of where most of humanity is. So to be cosmocentric, if one actually reaches that stage, you are like 1% of the 1% of people who have actually reached this high stage of evolution where you're actually seeing the oneness of everything. You don't see a separation between you and everything else. So with that, I drew this picture. Look at my beautiful artwork. And I wanted to illustrate the point that these are concentric circles, meaning that the higher you get in the stages, you include the lower levels. So if you become ethnocentric, within you is still egocentrism. If you become world-centric, within you is still ethno and ego. If you become cosmocentric, within you is still world, ethno, and ego, but it does not work the other way around. In other words, an egocentric person cannot see into the world of the ethnocentric person. The ethnocentric person cannot see into the world of the world-centric person. And that distinction right there is very important because, like I said, most of the world is in this ethnocentric place, and they're saying division, our country and your country, my team and your team, my politician and your politician. They're in this state of division, and they believe because they're in that state of division that that is the truth. And this is a relative level of truth. This is an important distinction to make because it's not that their worldview is false. From the stage of their development, it is very true how they're seeing things, and they could assimilate evidence. You could assimilate evidence to say, okay, I see how they're seeing that, because from a top-down perspective, you could actually see into the ethnocentric category and still be able to say, okay, I recognize that. If you're world-centric, remember, you still have ethnocentricity. You still have egocentricity within you. Those are still states of being that you have access to. It's just you're able to see it from a higher perspective because you've become world-centric. Now, world-centric, it's important to recognize that this is like, I've talked about the trinary model, where in a lot of the world, we're operating in this like duality, this division of like this side and this side. And the world-centric gives you access to like the top of the pyramid, as I've talked about before. This is where like you don't see the need to divide. And the interesting thing about like ethnocentric people and the state of the majority of the population is they will see people who don't choose this division as passive, because the only thing their mind is capable of perceiving is, if it's not us, it's them. Therefore, if you're not with me, you're against me. If you're not involved in the system of duality that I'm getting involved in, then you are the opposite of me. That's the state of consciousness of most people. So, my friends, when it comes to dealing with people and when it comes to actually interacting with people, we need to be aware of where we might stand within this spectrum and where others might stand, because you could bring someone all of these frameworks and ideas of a world-centric or cosmocentric point of view, but if they're still in egocentrism or ethnocentrism, they're not going to be able to assimilate that information from that higher point of view. They're going to take that information and somehow fit it into their box, fit it into the prism that they're existing within, and they're not going to be able to see how you're seeing things. So this is important to note just as you go about interacting with people, because it's not that they're like outright just trying to maybe talk down on what you're saying or trying to not understand what you're saying. It's that their ego, like their own conscious development of their ego, has not yet reached the stage where it can understand information in that sort of way. And that's because they, as people, are still in a state of division. This is like why this is so prevalent on Earth right now is we have these two hemispheres of our brain, right? And then obviously like the synchronization of the hemispheres would be getting into the third eye, like the pineal gland, like the center and the harmonization of the two hemispheres. Most of humanity has not achieved that. They have not reached that stage, so they're polarizing. It's always this back and forth dance that they're going on. That's their frequency. And if that's their frequency, this is a much slower bandwidth. It means their frequency cannot actually, it's not in the same bandwidth that can handle that higher level of information. This is the same as like if you had a computer and you were to plug like a cable into it that could only handle like 5 MB, so like a very low amount of data, versus plugging a cable in that could handle like 500 MB, a much higher amount of data. You could be transferring the same file and it wouldn't translate one way or the other. The software, in other words, would not be installed within that person to even process what that programming was. It'd be like trying to run these new softwares and it would look like Windows 95 in their head. And they're not understanding, well, this is how the program looks. Like this is how it is. Like I can see it. It's right there. And because you're opposing me, you're this division. So they see it as division. Like I said, you cannot perceive the world as anything other than a reflection of yourself. So for those who see the world in this divided manner, it's because they are divided themselves. And to bring them a unified consciousness, all they're going to do is see that as something other than them. So my friends, it's important for us to have this awareness and also be able to recognize that even within ourselves, even when you become world-centric, you're still going to have opinions as to like who's me versus who's other, who's my people versus who's other. You're still going to have those opinions, but you're just going to be able to see it from a point where you don't necessarily polarize yourself. But you can see that there still are divides. So within that, you can use that awareness to actually work with people from where they are, as opposed to trying to get them up to your level, to get them up to your speed, quite literally, on certain issues, certain ideas. It's important to treat people with compassion because everyone in this world is just doing the best that they can. And it's just often that most people are in a state of lacking self-awareness. They've not become conscious of themselves. They've not stepped into a state of realizing the sort of illusions that are happening here that are actually keeping people in these divided states. So with that, my friends, I just wanted to break down this concept so we can see the world in a more intrinsic sort of way. Everyone is at their own level, and that's something to be respected. And also, you're going to do yourself a huge favor if you don't assume that everybody's able to see the world the same way you can. I'm sure a lot of you have had experiences with that anyways. So with that, my friends, hope that all makes sense. Be whole, be well, and take care. We'll talk soon.